The guy who hated me the most knew my darkest secret. So why was he the only one willing to stand between me and the entire campus? The giant LED screen above the auditorium flickered once before my name appeared in bold white letters, Ethan Brooks. A wave of confused whispers rolled through more than 1,000 students packed inside Westbridge University's annual Academic Excellence Awards. My stomach dropped. That wasn't part of the program. A second later, folders, emails, and private files began flashing across the screen faster than anyone could read them. I recognized every file name instantly. My pulse slammed against my ribs. Those were mine. My hands turned cold as panic rushed through every nerve in my body. Someone had found the secret I'd spent 2 years protecting. Cameras lifted into the air. Phones followed. Conversations stopped. Every pair of eyes in the auditorium slowly shifted toward me. I couldn't breathe. If those files stayed on the screen for another few seconds, everything I had built would disappear. My scholarship, my reputation, my future. I heard someone behind me whisper, "Is that Ethan?" Another voice answered, "No way. Is that actually real?" I wanted to stand. I wanted to run. Instead, I froze in my seat as though the floor had swallowed my feet. Then another chair scraped loudly against the polished wood floor. The sound echoed through the silent auditorium. Mason Carter stood up. Of course it was him. Captain of the basketball team. President of the Business Society. The most recognizable student on campus. My academic rival since freshman year. The one person who celebrated every time he beat me on an exam by half a point. We had spent 2 years trying to outwork, outscore, and outsmart each other. If anyone had asked me that morning who would enjoy watching my life fall apart, I would have answered with his name without hesitation. Mason walked straight into the aisle without taking his eyes off the stage. His expression wasn't smug. It wasn't amused. It was unreadable. The faculty members looked just as confused as everyone else, while technicians frantically tried to shut off the screen. Whoever had hacked the system knew exactly what they were doing. The files kept appearing. My heartbeat grew louder than the crowd. I lowered my head, already preparing myself for the humiliation that was about to follow. Then I heard Mason's voice. Calm, steady, impossible to ignore. "If anyone wants to go after Ethan," he said, loud enough for the entire auditorium to hear, "you'll have to get through me first." Silence swallowed the room. My head snapped upward before I could stop myself. Mason wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring toward the control booth above the auditorium, as if he already knew who had orchestrated everything. The whispers returned, louder this time, filled with confusion instead of judgment. Why would Mason defend me? Why would my biggest rival risk his own reputation for someone he supposedly couldn't stand? None of it made sense. Because the truth was, 1 month earlier, if someone had told me Mason Carter would become the only person standing between me and the worst day of my life, I would have laughed right in their face. Back then, he wasn't my protector. He was the last person on campus I ever wanted to see. 1 month earlier, Westbridge University looked exactly the way every admissions brochure promised. Red brick buildings glowed beneath the late September sun. Students hurried across wide sidewalks carrying coffee cups and overloaded backpacks, and the bell tower chimed every hour as though nothing complicated could possibly happen on a campus this beautiful. That illusion lasted until I spotted Mason Carter walking across the main quad. He was laughing with 2 teammates, one hand tucked into the pocket of his navy jacket, completely relaxed, completely confident, as if the entire university naturally revolved around him. Some people measured semesters by midterms or football games. I measured mine by how many times Mason managed to beat me. Freshman orientation trivia contest. Mason. Economics case competition. Mason. Student Senate debate. Mason. Business analytics challenge. Me by 1 point. Mason spent an entire week reminding me it had only happened because he caught the flu. We competed over everything without ever agreeing to compete at all. If my exam score appeared on the class portal first, his would appear 5 minutes later with 1 extra percentage point. If I volunteered for a research project, somehow he would join the same project before the week ended. We never exchanged insults loud enough for professors to hear, but every conversation carried the same invisible challenge. Beat me if you can. I reached the psychology building just as Professor Linda Harris posted the results from our interdisciplinary scholarship evaluation. A small crowd immediately gathered around the bulletin board. I squeezed through the students until my eyes found the list. Ethan Brooks, 98. Right below it sat another familiar name. Mason Carter, 98. I closed my eyes for exactly 1 second. Of course. A tie. Again. Someone behind me chuckled. Looks like the king and the prince are still refusing to let each other win. I did not have to turn around to recognize Mason's voice. Funny, he replied. I was thinking the exact same thing. I finally faced him. His blue eyes held the calm confidence that always irritated me more than open arrogance. Maybe next time they will make the test harder, I said. Maybe, he answered with a slight smile. Or maybe you should stop making it so easy to keep up with you. The surrounding students laughed. I rolled my eyes, grabbed my notebook, and walked away before he could see the tiny smile threatening to appear on my own face. That was the strange part about Mason. He knew exactly how to get under my skin without ever crossing the line. Classes ended just after 4 o'clock, but my afternoon was far from over. I still had 3 hours scheduled inside the neuroscience lab, organizing research data that almost nobody else wanted to touch. Quiet rooms filled with spreadsheets and humming computers were comfortable, predictable, unlike people. I slipped my backpack onto the empty chair beside my workstation and quietly checked the small zippered pocket hidden inside. A slim silver flash drive rested exactly where I had left it. I exhaled in relief before locking the drawer beneath the desk. Nobody could ever know what was stored on that drive. Nobody could ever connect it to me. As I turned back toward the computer monitors, I caught the faint reflection of someone standing outside the glass laboratory door. Mason had stopped in the hallway for only a second before continuing down the corridor, but for reasons I could not explain, it felt as though our rivalry had just wandered a little too close to the one secret I could never afford to lose. The neuroscience lab became almost silent after 7 o'clock. Most students had already gone back to their dorms or the student center, leaving only the low hum of computers and the occasional click of a keyboard drifting through the room. I liked it that way. Quiet made it easier to think. Quiet never asked questions. I finished organizing another stack of research files before rubbing my tired eyes and glancing at the clock. 7:23. I stretched, grabbed my empty coffee cup, and headed toward the vending machines at the end of the science building. The hallway was nearly deserted. Outside, the September sky had faded into deep shades of blue, and rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking the courtyard. 10 minutes later, I returned balancing a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a granola bar in the other. The moment I stepped back into the lab, something felt wrong. Nothing had moved. Every chair sat exactly where I had left it. Every monitor still glowed with the same spreadsheets. Yet the tiny hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My desk drawer was not completely closed. Barely half an inch. Almost invisible unless you knew exactly how you had left it. My heartbeat skipped once. I set the coffee down so quickly that a few drops spilled onto the countertop. No. I pulled the drawer open. Empty. The silver flash drive was gone. Every sound inside the room disappeared. My thoughts crashed into one another. Maybe I had moved it earlier. Maybe it had slipped into another pocket. Maybe I was overreacting. My shaking hands searched every compartment of my backpack. Pens, notebooks, charger, wallet, nothing else. I checked my jacket, my desk, the floor beneath the chair. Nothing. The flash drive had vanished. My breathing became uneven. That tiny piece of metal held months of private journal entries, medical documents, personal letters, and the one truth I had promised myself nobody at Westbridge would ever discover. If the wrong person opened those files, they would understand everything I had spent years hiding behind perfect grades and careful smiles. Footsteps echoed outside the laboratory. Slow, unhurried. I looked toward the glass door just as someone stopped on the other side. Mason. He frowned the instant he saw my face. Before I could pretend everything was fine, he pushed the door open. "You look terrible," he said. "Are you sick?" I stared at him without answering. My mind refused to settle. He glanced toward the open drawer, then back at me. What happened? I almost told him to leave. Instead, the words escaped before I could stop them. Something is missing. Mason's expression shifted from casual curiosity to genuine concern. "Can I help you look?" I laughed once. It sounded hollow even to me. You helping me would be a first. A tiny smile touched the corner of his mouth, but it disappeared almost immediately. "Try me." We searched the laboratory together for nearly 20 minutes. Under cabinets, behind monitors, inside storage bins. Every minute made my chest feel tighter. Finally, I accepted what I had been refusing to believe. Someone had taken it. I leaned both hands against the edge of the desk, staring at the empty drawer as though the drive might somehow reappear if I waited long enough. Mason remained unusually quiet. Then his eyes settled on the floor beside the chair. He bent down and picked up a small laminated visitor badge that neither of us had noticed before. It was not mine. It belonged to someone from the university technology department. On the back, caught beneath the fluorescent lights, was a single fingerprint smudged across the plastic. Mason turned the badge over once before looking directly at me. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I think whoever took what you lost knew exactly what they were looking for." The badge rested in Mason's hand while the fluorescent lights reflected across the scratched plastic surface. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. Rain continued tapping against the laboratory windows with quiet determination, filling the silence neither of us seemed willing to break. Finally, I reached for the visitor badge, but Mason did not hand it over immediately. Instead, he studied the name printed beneath the university logo as though he was fitting together pieces of a puzzle I could not yet see. "Do you know anyone in the technology department?" he asked. I shook my head. "No." "Then whoever dropped this was not supposed to be here." He carefully placed the badge on my desk. "Do not report it yet." I stared at him in disbelief. "What? If someone intentionally took what belongs to you, reporting it immediately tells them you noticed. Right now they think they have time." I folded my arms. "Since when do you solve mysteries?" A faint smile crossed his face before disappearing again. "Since someone decided to leave clues lying on the floor." His calm confidence irritated me almost as much as it reassured me. I hated that both feelings could exist at the same time. We left the science building together a few minutes later. The evening air carried the cool smell of wet pavement, and students hurried across campus beneath colorful umbrellas, laughing as though nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. I envied them. Every passing face suddenly looked suspicious. Every conversation sounded like it might somehow be about me. We reached the intersection where our paths usually separated. "Get some sleep," Mason said. "You look exhausted." I almost laughed. "You think I can sleep after this?" He looked at me for a moment longer than usual. "Then at least promise me you will not tell anyone what was on that drive." My heart skipped. I searched his face for sarcasm, for curiosity, for the satisfaction I had expected from my biggest rival. I found none of them. "Why do you care?" I asked quietly. Mason slipped both hands into his jacket pockets. "Because if someone stole it on purpose, then your secret matters to somebody else already." Before I could ask another question, he turned and walked toward the parking lot, disappearing into the drizzle without looking back. I stood there far longer than I should have. His words refused to leave my mind. The next morning, campus life continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Professors lectured. Students complained about homework. Coffee lines stretched through the student center. Yet every notification on my phone made my pulse jump. Every email felt dangerous. I checked social media between classes expecting to see my private life spread across the internet. Nothing. Not a single post. Not a rumor. Not even an anonymous message. The silence was almost worse than exposure. Whoever had my flash drive was waiting. Waiting for the perfect moment. 3 days passed. Then 4. Still nothing. During that time, Mason did something even stranger. He never mentioned the missing drive again. He never asked what was stored on it. He never tried to corner me with questions or use it against me during class discussions. If anything, he acted exactly the same as always, competing with me during debates, making sarcastic remarks when our professors compared our grades, and walking away before either of us could accidentally have a normal conversation. That should have made me feel relieved. Instead, it unsettled me even more. Because if Mason already knew something about my secret, he was hiding it better than anyone I had ever met. And somehow, that silence had become far more frightening than any threat he could have spoken out loud. 5 days after the flash drive disappeared, I almost convinced myself that whoever had taken it had either failed to unlock it or decided it was worthless. That fragile sense of relief lasted exactly 12 minutes. Professor Linda Harris walked into our behavioral research seminar carrying a stack of folders and an expression that immediately warned everyone she was about to ruin our week. She placed the folders on the front desk and smiled far too brightly. "Congratulations," she announced. The university has selected this class for the National Undergraduate Research Challenge. Your final project will be completed in pairs, and your presentations will determine which team represents Westbridge. A chorus of groans echoed through the room. Group projects were dangerous enough without adding national judges and scholarship committees. Professor Harris ignored the complaints and began reading names from her clipboard. Every pair sounded predictable until she reached the final page. Ethan Brooks and Mason Carter. The room erupted before either of us could react. Someone laughed loudly from the back row. Another student muttered, "This is going to be entertaining." I slowly turned toward Mason. He was already looking at me with the same mixture of surprise and reluctant amusement reflected on my own face. "Absolutely not," I said before Professor Harris could continue. She folded her arms. "Excuse me. We cannot work together." "Why?" she asked calmly. I opened my mouth, only to realize I had no answer that sounded remotely professional. Because we competed too much? Because he irritated me? Because trusting him felt impossible after everything that had happened? None of those reasons belonged inside a classroom discussion. Professor Harris smiled knowingly. "Exactly. You are both exceptionally capable students. Learning to collaborate is part of becoming professionals. My decision is final." The lecture continued, but I barely heard another word. The moment class ended, I stuffed my notebook into my backpack and headed for the exit. "Ethan." I pretended not to hear him. "Ethan." Mason caught up beside me halfway across the hallway. "Running away already?" "I am walking. Very quickly. Away from you." He laughed quietly. "Fair enough." I kept moving until we reached the student center courtyard. Autumn leaves drifted across the brick walkway, while students gathered around outdoor tables with hot coffee and laptops. Mason finally stepped in front of me, forcing me to stop. "Look," he said, "neither of us asked for this assignment. That does not mean I have to like it." "Good," he replied, "because I was not planning to make this easy for you either." I stared at him, expecting another sarcastic remark, but his expression remained serious. "We both want to win," he continued. "If we spend the next 6 weeks trying to sabotage each other, we both lose." I hated how logical that sounded. "So what are you suggesting?" He pulled out his phone and opened the project schedule. "Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, library study rooms." "You already booked one?" 30 minutes after Professor Harris announced the teams. I blinked. "You assumed I would agree?" "No," Mason admitted with a small grin. "I assumed you would eventually realize it was the smartest option." Before I could answer, a familiar voice called Mason's name from across the courtyard. One of his basketball teammates jogged toward us carrying a backpack over one shoulder. The teammate glanced at me briefly before lowering his voice. "Hey, did you ever figure out what happened with that technology department visitor badge?" Mason's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Later," he answered quickly. "Not here." My pulse quickened. He had been investigating without telling me. And for the first time since the flash drive vanished, I realized Mason Carter might know far more than he had ever admitted. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in cool autumn air and the quiet rhythm of campus before football games, and weekend crowds filled every sidewalk. The university library smelled faintly of old paper, fresh coffee, and polished wood, the kind of place where every whisper seemed louder than normal. I reached study room 7 at exactly 9 o'clock, fully expecting Mason to stroll in a few minutes late just to prove he could. Instead, he was already there. A laptop sat open in front of him beside 2 neatly organized notebooks, color-coded sticky notes, and a pair of coffees waiting on the table. He glanced up as I entered. "You are on time," he said. "So are you." I answered before realizing how strange that sounded. "I have a reputation to protect," he replied with an amused smile. "People already think I spend too much time competing with you." I dropped my backpack onto the chair across from him. "Maybe because you do. Only because you keep giving me reasons." I almost rolled my eyes, but something felt different today. There was no audience. No classmates waiting to see which one of us would win another pointless exchange. Just 2 students sitting across from each other with 6 weeks to build a research project neither of us could finish alone. We spent the next 2 hours arguing over research methods, survey design, statistical models, and presentation structure. Every disagreement somehow made the project stronger. Every challenge forced the other person to think harder instead of becoming defensive. It was exhausting. It was unexpectedly enjoyable. Around noon, I rubbed my temples and leaned back in my chair. You know, I admitted reluctantly, your sampling model actually works better than mine. Mason looked up from his laptop, clearly surprised. Did Ethan Brooks just admit I was right? Do not get used to it. He laughed, the sound quieter than I expected, genuine instead of triumphant. I will frame this moment forever. We left the library to grab lunch from the student union. The line stretched almost to the entrance, giving us nearly 15 minutes with nothing to do except wait. It should have been awkward. Somehow it was not. Mason asked about my psychology research. I asked about his internship applications. We discovered we both hated public speaking despite looking perfectly confident in front of classrooms. We both preferred black coffee. We both stayed on campus during most holiday breaks because going home was complicated for different reasons neither of us fully explained. By the time we carried our trays outside, the rivalry that had defined us for 2 years felt strangely quiet. Not gone, just resting. We found an empty picnic table beneath a maple tree glowing with orange leaves. Halfway through lunch, Mason's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and immediately silenced it without answering. A second notification appeared, then a third. His easy expression disappeared. Everything okay? I asked before I could stop myself. He hesitated. Not exactly. I waited, expecting him to change the subject. Instead, he slowly reached into his backpack and pulled out a thin manila folder. He placed it on the table between us, but kept one hand resting on top of it. I was not going to tell you until I knew more, he said quietly. But I think you deserve to see this. My pulse quickened. What is it? Mason looked directly into my eyes. Everything I have been able to find about the person who stole your flash drive. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The autumn breeze scattered a handful of leaves across the table, but my attention never left the folder sitting inches from my hands. Whatever was inside had the potential to answer every question that had haunted me for the past week, or create far more than either of us was prepared to face. My fingers hovered above the folder for several seconds before I finally opened it. Inside were printed security camera stills, copies of visitor access records, and handwritten notes arranged with surprising precision. None of it looked official. It looked personal. Mason had clearly spent days putting everything together. I looked up at him. How long have you been doing this? He leaned back in his chair and quietly answered. Since the night your flash drive disappeared. I turned to the first page. The technology department visitor badge belonged to a temporary systems contractor named Ryan Holloway. According to the access log, Ryan had checked into the science building that evening even though no maintenance work had been scheduled. Another page showed a grainy security image of the hallway outside the neuroscience lab. The timestamp matched the exact period when I had gone to buy coffee. A man wearing a maintenance jacket stood outside my laboratory door. His face was partially hidden beneath a baseball cap, but the visitor badge clipped to his pocket matched the one Mason had found. How did you get all this? I asked. Mason looked almost embarrassed. My roommate works in campus security during weekends. He helped me check the public visitor records. Everything else came from people asking questions they did not realize they were answering. I stared at the photographs again. Why? The single word escaped before I could stop it. Mason did not pretend not to understand. Because I knew you were terrified. His answer caught me completely off guard. You barely even like me. A quiet laugh escaped him. That is where you have been wrong for almost 2 years. I blinked. Mason folded his hands together on the table before continuing. Do you really think someone spends 2 years competing with a person they do not respect? I searched for a sarcastic punchline. None came. Freshman year, he said. You answered a question during orientation that nobody else could solve. I remember thinking I had finally met someone who would force me to become better. I looked away, suddenly fascinated by the paper cup beside my hand. Then why always act like you wanted to beat me? Because I did. He smiled softly. But not because I wanted you to lose. The distinction settled somewhere deep inside me. Every competition, every debate, every challenge. I had interpreted them as hostility. Mason had experienced them as motivation. Before either of us could say anything else, his phone buzzed sharply across the table. This time he answered immediately. Hello. The color slowly disappeared from his face as he listened. Are you sure? A long pause followed. Do not tell anyone yet. I am on my way. He ended the call and stood so quickly that his chair scraped across the brick patio. What happened? I asked. Mason looked directly at me, his expression more serious than I had ever seen. Ryan Holloway resigned from his contract this morning. My stomach tightened. That means he is running. Mason nodded once. Maybe. Or maybe somebody told him his job was already finished. A cold breeze swept through the courtyard as if the campus itself had suddenly grown quieter. Mason gathered every page back into the folder before handing it to me. Keep this somewhere safe, he said. If anything happens, do not leave it in your dorm. I accepted the folder with trembling hands. You still have not told me why someone would go through all this just to steal one flash drive. Mason held my gaze for several silent seconds before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. Because I do not think they wanted the drive. He glanced toward my backpack. I think they wanted whatever truth was hidden inside it, and I am afraid they finally found a way to open it. The rest of that week passed beneath an invisible storm cloud. Classes continued. Assignments piled higher. Students complained about exams, football tickets, and cafeteria food, completely unaware that every vibration from my phone made my pulse race. I checked my email before breakfast, between lectures, during lunch, and again before going to bed. Nothing happened. That silence no longer felt comforting. It felt calculated. Whoever had opened my flash drive was waiting for the perfect moment, and every quiet day only made that moment feel closer. Mason noticed the change before I admitted it to myself. He stopped making sarcastic comments during class debates. Instead, he quietly slid copies of lecture notes across the table whenever I looked distracted. He walked with me after evening study sessions without pretending it was an accident. He never mentioned my secret, never asked what was inside those files, and somehow that restraint made me trust him more than any promise could have. Late Thursday afternoon, we met again in the library to rehearse our research presentation. We had barely opened our laptops when my phone buzzed against the table. Unknown sender. No name. No number. Just a single message. I opened it anyway. Nice speech you were preparing for the Academic Excellence Awards. It would be a shame if everyone learned who you really are first. Every ounce of color drained from my face. Mason immediately noticed. What is wrong? Without speaking, I handed him the phone. His expression hardened as he read the message. A second notification appeared before either of us could react. This time it included a photograph. My missing silver flash drive rested on a wooden desk beside an open laptop. The image was clear enough to remove every remaining doubt. Whoever sent the message still had it. Another line appeared beneath the photo. Watch the ceremony carefully. My hands trembled so badly, I almost dropped the phone. Mason gently took it from me before it slipped onto the floor. Do not answer, he said quietly. They want you scared. I already am, I admitted. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Students continued walking past the glass walls of the study room, laughing and carrying stacks of books, completely disconnected from the panic closing around us. Mason finally stood and walked toward the window overlooking the campus lawn. They are not threatening you privately anymore, he said without turning around. They are planning something public. The realization settled over both of us at the same time. The Academic Excellence Awards. The ceremony where every scholarship donor, faculty member, student leader, and local reporter would be watching. Exactly the place where one secret could spread across an entire campus in seconds. I slowly gathered my notebooks into my backpack, no longer thinking about our presentation or our grades. None of it mattered if my entire future disappeared first. As we stepped outside the library, the bell tower echoed across campus, announcing the end of another ordinary afternoon. Mason stopped halfway down the stone steps and looked directly at me. Listen carefully, he said with absolute certainty. Whatever happens at that ceremony, you are not facing it alone. I wanted to believe him. I truly did. But as I looked across the crowded campus, I noticed someone standing beneath the row of maple trees on the opposite sidewalk. The stranger wore a dark baseball cap pulled low over his face. The moment our eyes met, he lifted one hand just enough for the afternoon sunlight to catch a familiar silver object between his fingers. My missing flash drive. Then he smiled faintly, slipped it back into his pocket, and disappeared into the crowd before either of us could take a single step. The morning of the Academic Excellence Awards arrived beneath a cloudless October sky that looked far too peaceful for the knot tightening inside my chest. Students crossed the campus dressed in suits, dresses, and university blazers, while volunteers rushed between buildings carrying programs and floral arrangements. Everyone smiled. Everyone celebrated. I felt as though I was walking toward the end of a life I had spent years carefully building. Mason found me outside the auditorium 15 minutes before the ceremony. He handed me a cup of black coffee without saying a word. I accepted it with a tired smile. "You remembered." He shrugged. "You always drink black coffee before presentations." I stared at him. "You noticed that?" He looked almost embarrassed. "I noticed more than you think." Before I could answer, the auditorium doors opened and the crowd slowly moved inside. Faculty members welcomed donors. Cameras flashed across the stage. The giant LED screen glowed above hundreds of neatly arranged seats, exactly as it had in my nightmares all week. Our research presentation had earned top honors, placing Mason and me among the final award recipients. When our names were announced, we walked toward the front together. My heartbeat echoed louder than the applause. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice. The master of ceremonies stopped speaking. Every screen inside the auditorium suddenly turned black before folders and document windows began appearing one after another. My name filled the display. Gasps spread across the audience exactly as I had feared. My knees almost gave out beneath me. This was it. The moment I had been trying to prevent. The files were real. The panic was real. But before anyone could open the first document, Mason stepped forward and faced the audience instead of me. His voice carried clearly through the silent room. "Stop looking at him." Every conversation died instantly. Mason continued without hesitation. "Someone illegally accessed private information that never belonged to them. If you are interested in gossip, you are looking in the wrong direction. The real story is that someone violated another student's privacy to create this spectacle." His words shifted the room in a way I never expected. Curious whispers turned toward the control booth instead of toward me. Faculty members immediately signaled the technical staff. Campus security hurried toward the back of the auditorium. The files disappeared from the screen almost as quickly as they had appeared, replaced by the university seal. A member of the technology department rushed onto the stage and quietly apologized for what they called an unauthorized system breach. The ceremony paused while security escorted a man from the control area. Even from a distance, I recognized the baseball cap. Ryan Holloway never looked in my direction. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then stronger as the audience realized what had actually happened. I stood frozen beside the podium, unable to process any of it. Mason quietly leaned closer and whispered, "Your secret belongs to you. Nobody else gets to decide when you tell it." For the first time in weeks, I felt my lungs fill with a complete breath. Later that evening, we escaped the celebration and climbed onto the rooftop terrace above the library, where the campus lights stretched across the quiet town below like scattered stars. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. I finally looked at Mason and laughed softly. "I spent 2 years believing you were trying to ruin my life." He smiled at the city below. "I spent 2 years hoping you would eventually realize I was trying to keep up with you." I shook my head. "We wasted a lot of time." "Maybe," he answered. "Or maybe we needed all of it to end up here." The autumn wind carried another bell from the clock tower across the campus that had brought us together first as rivals, then as reluctant partners, and finally as two people who understood each other better than anyone else ever had. My biggest secret had not changed who I was. It had simply revealed who was willing to stand beside me when everything else fell apart. And somewhere between every challenge, every argument, every quiet conversation, and every impossible day, my greatest enemy had quietly become the person I trusted most.